Hi, welcome to today's show. I hope you've taken some time during this holiday season to spend some quality time with yourself, some time with other people, such as your family and your friends and your loved ones, that's not hurried and busy but relaxed. I also hope that you've taken this time to spend some time with the sacred. The holidays are a great time for us to take a step back and to really think about those things that we're thankful for, those things that we take for granted on a daily basis. But it's also a time for us to engage in self-reflection. Today's show, we're going to be doing just that, having a discussion about how do we engage in self-reflection in a way that will foster and channel the gifts that we have to make us live to our fullest potential. So we're joined today by someone who's going to bring us some insight around her experiences with coaching as she coaches educators and other organizations. We're going to look at that a little bit, and we hope that it'll be helpful to you today. I am joined today by my co-host, Susan Bainbridge, and today's guest, Marlecia Autrey. Thank you for joining us today, Marlecia.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things I want to do as we get started today, as always, is I want to just share with you who Marlecia is, and she'll talk a bit more about her experience as well. But Marlecia has worked with educators for about 20 years. In fact, she's an educator herself, because once an educator, you're always an educator. And in her recent years, she spent her time coaching other educators and individuals in other organizations to reach their highest potential. She served as a classroom teacher. She's been a staff development specialist. She's also been the director of learning and teaching in an equity-based company. Marlecia is a relational coach. And when I say relational coach, she works with organizations, helping them to find ways of working with one another and to strengthen their relationships with one another. She's spent a lot of time focusing on teachers and administrators. And so for the last few years, her focus has really been about team collaboration. So what she does is that she helps people to identify what are the challenges in your organization? What are the areas of growth that are needed within your organization? She has traveled extensively throughout the U.S., providing training seminars, coaching administrators, observing classrooms, and collaborating with teachers and lesson planning and doing lesson plans with them. I want to just acknowledge today, because a part of what we will be talking about in today's segment, we'll be talking about teachers and ways that teachers can self-reflect, and how Marlecia helps teachers to self-reflect in order to help their students find their greatest potential. I believe that most teachers go into teaching because they have a strong desire to help children. They want to empower them, they want to nurture them, they want to help them find their voice and help them to find their gifts. But sometimes it's challenging for teachers to do this. It's challenging for them to honor who they were called to be, the demands of their community, their district, their state, their country. They often interfere with the goals that teachers have. And so I want to say, though, despite those challenges, there is help out there. When you're feeling overwhelmed, there are people that you can call, and Marlecia Autrey is one of those people. So today, she's come so that she can help us talk about and help teachers and educators find ways to tap into their sacred intelligence. So again, I am delighted to have her, and I want to start today just by really talking with Marlecia, and Susan and I want to just probe her brain a bit to kind of find out what are some ways that she helps teachers to self-reflect. But as always, I'd like to start by asking Marlecia, why do you do what you do? Why are you passionate about your calling? What brings you into the work that you're in?
Well, it starts with just me. I think about when I was in school, elementary school, middle school. I grew up in Alabama. And from time to time, I would often feel like I was this detective trying to figure out, why is everybody doing this? Why is everybody doing that? And sometimes my teachers didn't necessarily connect with me, and as a black girl growing up at that time, even though I was in a space that was it was like the population was like half black, half white. Majority of my teachers were white, and sometimes they didn't connect with me, not because they weren't great teachers, it's just I showed up differently. And what brought me to the work was I wanted to be that teacher that I didn't have until I got to graduate school, who really was able to look at me and say, wow, Marlecia, I see what you're bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you say that you didn't get to that place until you got to graduate school. And I think about the kids that are lost, who never ever make it beyond high school because there's that disconnect.
Right.
And that disconnect could be because they're a black person growing up in Alabama or Connecticut, where we are, or New York, or anywhere. But they could also disconnect because of other reasons. Sometimes class issues have to do with it. Sometimes sexuality has to do with why people disconnect. Even when people are introvert, versus extrovert, all of those things. And so to have to go all the way to graduate school before you make that connection, that's profound. So tell us a little bit more then about what happened when you got to graduate school.
Right, and I just want to say this to all my teachers who might be listening. I'm not saying that they did not connect, but I mean really where I felt like I walked into the space, I was honored for who I was challenged, and sometimes it was hit or miss. Sometimes I was honored but not challenged. Sometimes I was challenged but not honored. And that's what came up, and the professor that I had, it was actually a black woman who actually allowed for me to go into my voice, and I was about to say find my voice, but I had a voice, but really go into it and develop it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to do with educators. And I think that, and this is just my belief, I don't know this for sure, but I think that she had to go through a lot of self-reflection to be able to step into the space, because she had a doctorate, for her to be able to say, you know what, I wonder if this is working for this particular student, if not. And that's some of the things that I feel like people are missing. It's just that pausing and stopping and saying, you know what, this interaction is not going the way I want it to go. How do I reflect on that? Or this interaction is going the way I want it to go. How do I reflect?
Well, earlier when we were talking, prior to coming for the show, you kind of talked about maybe the difference between a student who's an introvert and the teacher is an extrovert, and how that shows up. How should teachers self-reflect about something so basic as that?
Right, and if I think about the sacred, we talk about that, and then the selfish, like figuring out who you are and that relationship with self. I'm an introvert, and as a teacher, I had to realize that when I'm an introvert and students show up as extrovert and they're up in my face and I'm like, I don't need all that. I have to realize that that's going to disconnect that student from whatever it is I'm about to offer them. It could be the best lesson plan. It could be anything. They're not going to want to hear it because I just cut them off.
So what would you say?
I would, to a teacher,
because it is a little much when they're in your face.
The first thing is really thinking about how do I honor who I am, and that's where the reflection comes in. Because sometimes in education, we're trying to go to the strategy, and we don't stop and think, what do I need to do first before I go there? Once I honor who I am and say, okay, it's okay that I'm an introvert, then I need to co-create the space with my students and really think about, okay, how do we make this work? When that student comes up in my face, I'm like, okay, I need 5 minutes to get my mind right, and then we can go from there.
So I think that you're saying something really interesting in terms of just self-reflecting about where we are, because now I'm thinking cross-racially.
Yes.
And I think about how people of different races present themselves very differently.
Yes.
And sometimes some students, particularly some students of color, at least in my experience, and I know that Susan and I have worked together in a school setting before as well, in my experience, sometimes students of color would not come up to the teacher in just such a quiet sort of way.
Exactly.
They might have come up very excited and maybe expressing a
Right.
lot of emotions, because culturally that's what particularly for Black individuals, sometimes the expressions can be very emotional and very loving and glad, but teachers would
Right.
want to say, wait a minute, you're
Right.
being too loud, or they would get written up for
Exactly.
that. So in that way, the student then would disconnect if they thought that
Absolutely.
you were making some sort of judgment about that. So what would the teacher self-reflecting provide in a situation like that, when you're looking even cross-racially
Right.
at another individual?
Well, some of the things that I do with teachers is have them notice, that just got to notice who are the students that are coming up to me all the time, who are the students that I hardly ever see, and then asking themselves, let me just figure out why that is, and really looking at the fact that sometimes I might have, socially constructed in my head that excitement looks like this, or respect looks like this, or all of these things. They have to really, kind of delve down into it, but it starts with noticing. It starts with that notice place.
I think that's crucial, because I want to, if this was years ago, but I know that when Susan and I first began working together, one of the questions I asked her when she came into the school system, which was predominantly Black and brown students, sort of what impressions she had of the students, and how did that have to shift when she got there. And I don't know if you recall.
I remember talking about it, and I remember feeling that I would probably need to reach out in a different way than someone who shared all of the cultural, nobody shares all, but much of the cultural background of the students. And you said predominantly, but we're talking like over 90% minority students in that school. And yet you were one of, what, 3?
Right, people of color.
Faculty?
And actually, I want to use this as a teachable moment, because I don't say minority, because I choose to say people of color, because I think it diminishes in some way when you say that. But I think you're bringing up something critical, which was I was one of maybe 3, maybe
I'm
3,
thinking 3.
4.
Maybe 4.
There were 4 people of color in the school. And so what does that say? That if your school, the people who are teaching the students
They're
are
not
predominantly white.
They're not reflecting who you are and where you're coming from. And I knew going in, I mean, that was one of the reasons why I chose the school that I chose, was because I knew that it wouldn't help me grow as a counselor to only work with middle-class white students. So to further test sort of my ability to be culturally sensitive and aware, and to be willing to do my homework and kind of know what sorts of things might be different. I mean, I was just talking this morning with somebody about things as simple as whether or not a student looks you in the eye.
Right.
And I'm sure we've all heard stories about people, students getting in serious trouble because it's taken as disrespectful, like, look at me when I'm talking to you, is sort of unfortunately the Caucasian sort of response, because we're generally taught, that's a sign of respect, is to focus in on the person that you're speaking with and give them that eye contact. Whereas in other cultures, and certainly, I think Black people from many different areas come with a very different idea of what looking you in the eye might
Right,
mean.
because for instance, if my children look me in the eye too long when I'm reprimanding them about something,
Right.
I'm saying, you better look away when I'm talking to you,
Right.
because, and it depends on the look,
right.
because we know when somebody is giving us
Right.
the
Yeah.
evil eye sort
Yeah.
of look, right? But
I
one
wanted to add something kind of to what you were just saying. One of the things that I think about when I do the coaching, because I heard you, share your story as a white woman going in, and I think the piece that sometimes is missing, and it's about the shared, is that this conversation of you get to be honored how you showed up. That, even though in your, from your culture, looking in the eye is a sign of respect, it doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it another way of being. And if you don't have that offer, that space of self-reflection, then you're not going to be able to get into the shared, because all of a sudden I'm going to make you wrong because you asked me to look me in the eye, and then my mama going to come up to the school and be like, why you brought my baby to you in the eye? and it's going to be on and popping, instead of, you know what, let me reflect on everybody doesn't think like I do. And let me figure out where you're coming from, so that we can have a different shared experience.
And I think that the greatest teachers that we have are the teachers who are able to do that, who are able to reach and accept students where they are. When I worked in this particular school, I can't tell you how many students said, I'm so glad that they have somebody Black working here, right? And it's because we connected in a certain way. Now, did that mean that I wasn't tough on them when I needed to be? Did that mean that I didn't hold them to high standards? Of course I did. I held them to very high standards, but we could connect because I could respect them. And what's really interesting is even our shared language around some things, because I will never forget, I was working with a group of Black and brown males, and we were just talking about the language. One student had gotten expelled for saying he was going to pop somebody.
Right.
So they thought that meant he had a gun. And that's not what it meant at all. He just meant that he was probably going to smack him.
Right.
And so then we got into a conversation, and I said, yes. I said, just like I used to say to students when I was in school, I can say this now since I'm no longer in school, I would say, I'm going to jack you up.
Oh, that was mine too.
I would say that in a minute. And I'd put that look on my face, and I'd say, I'm going to jack you up if you don't stop doing that. So there was this white woman who was sitting in the group, who we were really good friends, and she was engaged in racial equity work.
Right.
And she said, if I had heard you say that, I probably would have reported you because I would have thought you were being abusive. And we talked to the kids and we said, do you feel threatened when I say that?
Right.
And they said, no, that we just know that you mean we better stop and get ourselves, in line. But that's the sort of racial and cultural differences that you have to be aware of and to self-reflect.
Exactly.
That's what I was going to come back to, is that a lot of, I think, what I needed to be very careful about was not coming at the students as if I knew.
Right.
And because how could I? We can't ever be in someone else's shoes. So I knew it was very important, even with other white students, whoever I was working with, that you don't ever act as though, I get it. I know where you're coming from. Well, yeah, maybe we can relate on various levels, and maybe we have a whole lot more in common than we ever would have imagined. But for me, it was the constant self-reflection and realizing I need to be authentically who I am. I need to not pretend that I'm not a middle-aged white woman.
Right.
I mean, a middle-class white woman.
I was going to say,
I'm not yet. I definitely wasn't then.
But I think the students who connected with their white teachers more were the teachers who just really accepted their students where they were in the process. So how do you help teachers begin to self-reflect, and how do you do it in a way that the teacher doesn't feel threatened by what are you saying about my teaching style or strategy? How do you?
I mean, I believe that there has to be this building of respect. And really, I know, you talk about the sacred, and I know in schools it's not always this conversation about what does that look like, but I would offer there is a sacred in the schools. It may not show up religious, but it is a sacred, a way of being, really looking at a higher calling that we're drawn to. So starting with that relationship of, I'm going to value you for who you are, you're going to value me, and then in the disconnect, that's where we have the shared, that's where we have the conversation, that's where we pause and say, let me step back and think about what am I bringing to the table that may be disconnecting from my colleague here, what is she bringing to the table, and really pausing and having a lot of time to say, let's pause and say, how did that go? We just got finished having conversation, or I just offered you something. Like earlier when I offered you a piece, I could have offered you something else, and I could have noticed body language, and I could have said, you know what, I just offered you that, but that was just my perspective. That was just where I'm coming from. How are you sitting with it? Having that time to break those things up. And I would offer, I talk a lot about teachers, but this could happen in corporate America. This could happen when you go to the Target and the woman puts your money on the table, and you're like, because I know that's happened to me where I've been given change and it's just been handed on the table. Sure. I can go right to, you're racist and all of this and let me get the manager, or to, I noticed you put my money on the table. Is there a reason you didn't put it in my hand? And I could say that in many different ways. Right. So I have to check myself to see. And if I do, I'm a human being. I'm going to mess up. So let's say I do come out of my head, as James Brown would say, and say, why are you putting my money on the table like that? Right. Then I catch myself, and then I have to say, you know what, I'm sorry. Let me say that a different way.
So the self-reflection is important in all areas. And of course, when you tell a story, it makes us kind of think of stories, because I and Susan has heard this story before. I had an experience where I went into this store, I will not name, and no one offered to help me. And I was shopping, but I noticed that they're helping other people. So of course, my assumption is, are you not helping me because I'm black? Because that does happen, right? Well, I left that store and went next door to another store and spent my money there. Fast forward 8 or 9 years later, I'm talking to a white woman who is a white woman of means, and she owns her own business, and we were just talking about pushy salespeople. Now, she owns a store, and she was saying she hates pushy salespeople because she thought one of her people was being a little pushy towards me. And I was like, it was fine. And she said, but on the other hand, I don't like people who don't offer to help me. And she mentioned the exact same store where I didn't receive the help. But you see, it was the assumption that I made. So there are sometimes there are valid reasons we make those assumptions. But if we take a step back, reflect, but I also heard you say something else, which is open the conversation.
Yes, exactly.
So that's critical.
Seek for more understanding. And something I want to make explicit too, particularly with the story that you just gave, as a person of color, I get to be self-reflective too with respect to race and whatever the situation is. So if I feel like I'm being discriminated against because of my race, my gender, whatever that piece is, even looking at the dominant society that may be, disenfranchising me, I still need to be self-reflective, because it may be that, that store was told, you know what, don't be pushy with the clientele. Or it might be what we think it is. And I think absent that, it becomes a one-sided conversation, particularly with respect to race, where it's only my white colleagues who have to be reflective. And I'm saying in any situation, I believe everyone needs to figure out where their level of reflection is. And we're talking about race, we could be talking about gender, we could talk about anything.
Now, I want to ask, and particularly because Susan and I, as therapists, it's often hard to get people to self-reflect. And so I wonder, with the people that you work with, I suppose if they're coming to you one-to-one and voluntarily as teachers saying, can you help me through this process? They're open to the self-reflection. But if you go into, let's say, a district where administrators have brought you in, how easy is it, or difficult is it?
It's not easy. Can I sing it out loud? It's not easy. Because there is a level, again, there's a level of, there has to be this relationship built, and there has to be, and I believe relationship can be built very quickly. and it doesn't mean it's going to be a deep, long-lasting, forever, ever relationship. It's something for me to say, okay, there's a door open that I can get to have this conversation with you. But with people who are not, maybe not either knowing that they need to be in this place of self-reflection or not wanting to, there has to be a place for me to open the door to say who you are and how you are is valued in this space. Doesn't mean that I agree with everything that you believe in, doesn't mean that I think everything that you believe in is right or is not hurting someone else. It's just you're valued to be in this space. And if people are able to walk into the space just as they are, then there's the space for us to say, okay, now let's look at where we could. But if I start out with you aren't doing, it's a harder conversation.
So I hear two things there too when you're coming. I hear the word respect. I have a respect for who you are, whether I agree or not. But I also hear love, and I know that a part of your mission is all about this love and trust. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Just really, unconditional love, really, standing in that. And we talked how different cultures could value respect differently. So I want to be explicit about, how I'm offering respect to someone, and that's where that self-reflection comes in as well, because I may be coming in offering respect in a way that people aren't even seeing as respect. So how am I reflective enough to kind of test the waters to see who's connecting. But if if we're humans, we're human beings, and we have a connection in that way, everything else circles around that. And if we're not in a space to say, okay, let me get to my place of, I want to leave people better than I found them, not wounded or depleted. That's my mission, and I can't put that on everyone else. But that's, if I feel like I've left a space and someone's wounded and depleted because I'm trying to teach them something, then it's not worth it for me.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that's really critical, because one of the things I'm thinking about is that with the work that you do, and having done some work in terms of working with educators in the past, and I know with the work that Susan and I do when we're working with groups ourselves, when you can teach people about self-reflection, no matter what area it is, it actually translates into other parts of their lives. So that in their relationships at home, they can be more self-reflective, in their relationships in their sacred spaces, wherever those are, because a lot of tension happens in sacred spaces as well, right? They could learn to be more open to hearing other people's points of views. And I think the thing about self-reflecting is that it allows you to listen differently.
It does, so that you can have a different outcome. Because the big thing around the work that I'm doing is like, what's the outcome? If we're just sitting around having conversation and we never get to a place of change for whatever the space is, then it's great. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but what will happen is there's no transformation. And if we are thinking about in our schools, if we're thinking about a nation, particularly now the things that are going on within our nation, I believe that there has to be a responsibility and accountability to say that we want to have a different outcome. We want to have a different outcome than we've had before. And that's why I feel like sometimes it's difficult. Having any kind of conversation that's difficult, that self-reflection place has to be in it, no matter what it is. Because if not...
That self-reflection place is the selfish place that we speak of, right?
Place. Going into yourself, so that you can have a deeper shared space, and it's honoring the sacred.
Right. See, there you go. All of it there together. But you're talking about outcomes. What are some of the outcomes that you, with the work that you do with teachers, administrators, organizations, what are some of the outcomes that you think your work will bring about?
Well, I believe outcomes would be, no matter what situation they're in, even if it's one that they've never dealt with before, they have a way of being that's different than they had before, that'll allow for them to step into that situation differently, to connect differently, or at least to seek out different resources than they would before, instead of spinning their wheels or saying, okay, I'm not going to deal with this, or just waiting for it to blow over. Really enabled to teach others and work with others who may come in with a different, who may not have worked in this way, to be able to say, you know what, I noticed that in you because I had that in myself. again, self-reflection.
Right. So what I really think is really good about this, though, is because you keep talking about the connection piece. And when we are able to connect with our students, we bring out the best of who our students can possibly be. And so if that student is over there and they're sitting in the corner like a little quiet mouse, but all of a sudden you connect with them in some way, wow, you've just opened up a whole new world. And I think about it from a psychological place. Sometimes we have people who suffer from anxiety or depression, and they're going to be quiet. But when they connect with you, even the boisterous students.
Yes.
I, as a school psychologist, I worked with a number of students who would raise holy hell up and down the hallways all the time. And I would have teachers to say, they shouldn't even be in school. And I'm thinking, we're saving their lives because of whatever they were dealing with on the outside. But I would have some of the most difficult students that if I said something to them in the hallway,
or even look at them.
Yeah, looked at them, and they didn't even know me because I'm the school psychologist. And if I say, watch your language, or if I said, come to my office. I remember once I had this student, he was cursing this girl. They both were cursing each other. Now, I didn't know him, I knew her, and I told him to watch his mouth. He sort of ignored me, but the next day I saw him in the dean's office, and I said, when you get done here, come to my office. He came. Now, this student didn't know me from Adam, as they say. He came to my office, and I told him I didn't ever want to hear him dishonoring a female like that again. And, I even talked to him about some racial, cultural stuff too, like honoring himself and honoring.
Yes.
And so I connect with him, and he said, okay. Now, I'm not saying that he never, didn't do it again, but in that moment, he did not disrespect me. He sat quietly and he listened. It was like, why should she care enough about me to even talk with me? So I see that connection actually helps to foster.
Yeah, and when I'm modeling connection in the coaching, then a lot of the teachers, a lot of the administrators, the people I work with, they have it within them, but it's like a muscle that sometimes isn't worked out a lot because, you talked about earlier, there's a lot of things put on educators around, you've got to have this, test scores, test results, all of this that sometimes that slips under. So it gives them the opportunity to say, just like you did with the student, not only am I going to talk to you about what I saw, I'm also going to talk to you about who you are. Like you're there too, and sometimes that part of the conversation is missing. It's more of a deficit place.
It must be good for you though when you see a teacher when the light bulb goes off with them, right?
Absolutely.
Because when you do this work, I can think about. I know the work that you do around racial equity and all of that, and that's difficult work. And Susan has done a lot of that work as well. I've done a lot of that work. But when you all of a sudden see that. Like, wow, that when they get it, when they start saying, wait a minute, it's not that she's like beating me up. She's trying to open my eyes to something different. So it must be exciting when you see that.
It's very much exciting because it's about the transformation of the person. And the work that I do, I don't want to be the guru or the expert. I want to be in partnership with people to help them see their best selves as I grow as well, because there's a lot of learning that happens for me as well.
So one of the things that I was thinking about a little bit earlier, we've been talking a lot about your work with educators and administrators and how the work that you do impacts eventually students, obviously. What I'm wondering about is whether or not what you offer could be readily translated into working with other populations. So, for instance, I personally went and traveled to Liberia several years ago and did training with them on anger issues and conflict resolution, nonviolent alternatives to to conflict resolution. And that training that I did with people from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Social Welfare, they took my training and they adapted it to use to train every corrections officer in the country, which sort of
it's very
yeah,
huge.
I'll
say
it's
it.
Huge.
That's huge.
That's right. That was you. That was living your
And
gift.
I didn't get to see how that translated to the corrections officers and what sort of response the folks that I trained were getting from those people, but I did get a lot of that
Right.
light bulb stuff going on. I mean, these are folks who had been through 14 years of civil war, essentially,
Right.
just huge amounts of violence and enormous racial tension,
Right.
From different tribal groups, and just while the country is obviously almost entirely black, that within those, okay, so maybe someone in this country wouldn't have a clear picture of, they're all black, but they have very different tribal
Yeah.
identifications
Right.
that are so strong that there's so much resentment left over
Right.
from the civil wars. And so reaching these people who had endured so much pain and upheaval, and of course people are angry.
Right.
And instead of punishing people for being angry,
Right.
as we often unfortunately do, I tried to help them look at, okay, so instead of immediately going to, punitive measures
Right.
to suppress the anger, why can't we look at what's underneath that anger,
Yes.
where that's coming from?
Yes.
What are the emotional underpinnings?
Yes.
That because anger doesn't just exist in a
Exactly.
vacuum. It comes from a place of feeling helpless or disenfranchised
Right.
or disrespected or
Right.
any of those things. And so getting that conversation going was really, really fascinating for
But
me.
I would think that in addition to helping them look at why they were angry and all that, in that process, they were taking a look at themselves.
That's absolutely
Yeah.
true. Yes,
Themselves, too.
I had these people who were, essentially going to be educators and whatnot, and take these skills to
Right.
other folks in their ministries. That was exactly it. I was having them do exercises themselves.
And so I guess I'm wondering too, with the work that you do, because
Right.
you said you do it with other organizations, how
Right.
your
So,
work.
yeah, this is what I'm wondering, does it translate to
It does translate, because if you break it down to the core, what tends to happen in education with administrators and teachers, or teachers and students, is this dynamic of power. Who has power? Who doesn't have power?
Yep.
And what does that look like? So if I take that conversation and the content in education, I have that. But if I go to corporate America and I'm working with, managers and administrative assistants, there's a conversation of who has power, who has power that we say they have power, who really has power, and how is that playing itself out? Are people feeling empowered? Because I can be your boss, but that doesn't mean that I have to disempower you in order for me to have the power. So how that works out is really breaking it down to, where do people feel like they step into the conversation? Do you feel like you have a voice? Do you feel like your voice is heard? And those types of questions, and it has to go, again, part of, we're talking about self-reflection today, but a part of that after that is like, once I've self-reflected, because I can be self-reflective and go, oh, I'm disempowering you, and then be like, okay, I can pat myself on the back and be done. But it's like, what's the next step?
And with everything that's going on today, I mean, this whole country is talking about race.
Exactly. Yes.
Right? I mean, the only way you're not talking about race is to be completely self-absorbed in a way
Right.
that we don't recommend. But really, it's about how are we to engage in this conversation about race. And so what do you think needs to happen with this conversation about race to move us forward? How do we move forward in the conversation?
I think there are different narratives that are going around, and some of those narratives are empowering and some of them are very disempowering. And if I really look at it across the board, there are narratives going around in the Black community and community of color. There's narratives going around in the white community who are very much racist, white community who are very much allies in the work. I think there has to be, one, an honoring of, this is my narrative, but then that space that we've been talking about, self-reflection of how is my narrative either promoting me to be closer or actually just, separating or being divisive. And there has to be a conversation about how do we now honor the narrative that's been there, because we can't erase it. But then now how do we start co-creating a different narrative as we're continuing on about how we connect? Because I think about it. I live in New York now, and sometimes I'm going down the street, and there's no judgment around this, but this is just my perspective. But sometimes there are people standing on the corner talking about Jesus, and they're like, Jesus said you need to do this, and I'm like, Jesus don't yell at me. My Jesus don't yell at me. And that's just my perspective. But if I can't hear that message, and then I have to be reflective too, even in this moment, am I judging that person because that's the way they show up? If I'm not able to co-create a conversation, then I'm going to miss whatever message you're saying, you're going to miss my message. And I think that's the missing piece. Honor the perspectives that we have, honor the narratives that we have right now, reflect on those narratives to see, is it pushing us forward, or is it continuing to make us more divisive?
And I think one of the things that, as you mentioned, our white allies, and there are plenty of white allies that we have in this conversation about race, and I think that the majority of time when I've interacted with white people who are wanting to talk about race is because they're wanting to hear a different narrative,
Yes.
and that they're not defensive about their own narrative. Right. They were born into really what I would say is privilege, right? And knowing and understanding and accepting that, that's fine. It's just different. I had a conversation today with a client, as a matter of fact. We started talking about race because she knows I was recently doing some work with a group of people in the church, actually. And we started talking about it and the importance of it is what it is, because she was saying, I'm sorry that you have to think about whether someone is watching you in a store. I said, it is what it is, but we can only change it when we begin to engage in the dialogue and people can recognize that this is what's happening, right. Not defend it. So that when you see a student, for instance, right. And you say that you're calling the student bad, or you're making statements about the student because they're being emotional, that they're emotionally disturbed. These are all very real labels when we worked in school systems. Yes. In fact, I was hired at the school system in order to not identify so many black and brown students as emotionally disturbed, right. Because I understood the perspective that right. they were coming from. And the particular person who hired me, which was a white woman, she said, I am bringing you in as a clinical person because I know that you have a different perspective. Right. That means that she was open to hearing the conversation. Right. And so when we're able to engage in that, we can stop making assumptions.
Exactly. And figuring out the different ways to engage. With respect to race, as people of color, we need to engage with ourselves, as I call it, around our own stuff. The stuff that we're holding on to that may not be serving us well, sure. In my white colleagues' dialogue. And then we need to come together. And that could go across the board, as I was talking about power dynamics. So if this work is done in other spaces, that may not specifically be talking about race, but talking about power. Those in power, either positional power or assumed power, need to have conversations with each other about, how is this playing itself out, and what are we going to do to make it play itself out a little bit differently? But I'm not going to always have the answer.
Well, we won't. But I think what's really crucial, and I know that both of you can speak to this, is that this issue of power, you have to be willing to give it up.
Yes.
So when you talk about changing
exactly.
the narrative.
Exactly. Or maybe changing the narrative, like I think honoring the narrative, and maybe there's another language around that. So honoring, because the narrative is what it is. But then
some
also
narratives
creating
are changing,
space.
though,
They do.
I would say.
But
so we may live in a racist society,
exactly.
but that narrative can change.
Right.
So
that we're not saying that. I get that.
Right. Because just because I may think that there is racism and there's a power dynamic. Right. If I think every white person I meet
exactly.
is racist towards me, then I won't have the relationships
exactly.
that I have.
Exactly.
And so I can't approach it in that
right.
way just because I know the society that I live in.
Exactly. I agree with that.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So I wonder though, if you're thinking about your work with educators, or even within organizations, how does it lead to institutional change, the work that you do?
It's really, as I was saying earlier, talking about those outcomes. The institutional change is really identifying what in the institution is not working and then putting different policies and procedures in place. And not just that, but a process to keep it there. Because once you say, okay, we're going to put this new policy in, sometimes I go into schools and they're like, okay, we don't have a lot of teachers of color or administrators of color. Now we're going to hire a lot of them. And then they're hired, but the system and the structure is not changed. And then something happens and then they're gone again. And it's like, what's the process that we need to put in place to check that? That might be different than before. Now we've hired X amount of people of color. How are we checking in with them about what their experience is? How are we checking in with our white colleagues about the fact that we hired extra and the narrative they might be running in their head about, well, that's not fair, isn't that reverse racism? Those types of things, you know.
But I want to point out, just because you hire a person of color does not mean the narrative is going to change.
That's right.
Because when I think about
point.
Schools and I think about the curriculum, the curriculum often does not represent
that was going to be the next level of this, and you're right into it. It's like the system needs to change as well, because I could come in as a teacher of color and teach just like the white teacher sitting next to me who is also blind or colorblind or not, but then my face is there, and it creates a whole different dynamic.
But now, I want you to speak to this for a bit, right? Because I imagine if you're a teacher and you're looking at this, this could be pretty dicey because, again, teachers are wonderful. We think teachers are wonderful, and teachers go into teaching because they want to help. But teachers will often say, well, I see students as students.
Right.
And will often speak to the fact that they were raised to be colorblind. And I always tell this wonderful story of this one teacher that I used to work with, and we talked a lot about race. Wonderful, wonderful teacher, though, because he brought in works of Maya Angelou and all these other African American artists, and then also Latina artists as well, and so or writers. And he was really great, but until we started having conversations about race, he didn't even recognize how he was unconsciously being racist about some things. So he told me a story one day about he was walking down the hallway and he was taking the AV machine back to the closet, and he saw this student in a classroom, empty classroom, rummaging through the desk. And he kept walking. He didn't stop the student. And he said it dawned on him that the reason he didn't stop the student was because he was a white male. He would have never thought of this before our conversations. He said if it had been a black male or even a Latino female, I would have stopped them. So once he became conscious, he walked back to the classroom and he said, "What are you doing in here?" Now, this is what the student said that a student of color would have never said. I don't believe. He said, "I'm looking for a pass so I can write myself a pass to class." So this student already knew his place in society. This is a high school student. So whether we're talking about race or not, students already recognize whether they are considered important or not. So I would imagine when you are a teacher, it's all wonderful to sing Kumbaya and we can all get along sort of thing. But really, the student wants you to see them as a different person. When I walk into a room, I want you to know that I'm a black woman. I want you to know that because if you notice that, then you're honoring who I am, and that's been your message to us. Is about
and it's the honoring. It is, and going to that, what you're saying is like I see all students the same. I've coached teachers around that. I said, let's unpack that a little bit more. So when you say you see students all the same, why are you saying that? And usually it gets down to because I don't want them to feel like I am discriminating against them or I think they're racist, or they think I'm racist. And I keep telling, that those are two different things that you have to unpack and saying that you are a black woman is not saying is not being racist.
Right.
But that's again the narrative that they've set in their head, that if I call you out for your race, that means I'm being racist. And that's where that reflection has to come in, so that you can sometimes, in some cases, change the narrative. But it's honoring the narrative that I only know what I know when I know it. And now I get to go a little
now,
bit deeper.
so we're talking openly about race here, but some people will say, you keep talking about it, you're just perpetuating the problems. I've had people to say to me, when I've had to teach my children about how to behave when they go in a store, because they have a habit of wanting to go and pick up something when they're at the cash register, especially when they were little.
Right.
And I would say, you need to stop picking things up
Right.
and just put it down, because
Right.
I don't want anybody to think that you're stealing. And I remember someone saying to me, white woman saying, she says, yes, but aren't you perpetuating a systemic, a racist society? And I said, I'm also teaching them how to survive.
Right.
And so there's that balance. So can you give me like
Well,
three reasons why we need to talk about it?
Because it's going to, wow, I had a story I was going to tell, but
Well, please
let me
share your
this.
story.
I lived in Minnesota for 6 years, and it is cold there, like crazy cold. Like I don't even know why it's that cold.
Yeah.
So kind of juxtaposing your story here. If I had a child and it's cold, and I'm consistently saying, you know what, when you go outside, you need to have your gloves on, you need to be wrapped up, you need to have all this on, you need to make sure you have your lip chap on, or your lips are going to get chapped, make sure we turn the car on. If someone were to say, you know what, you keep talking about it so cold, you're just perpetuating the fact that, I'm like, no, it's cold out there. I'm not perpetuating it, I'm preparing you to be there. And that's kind of what I see here. And the reasons we need to have this conversation is because sometimes in having the conversation, we identify what we do need to stop talking about if it's something that's not serving us. But sometimes it, just like your colleague that had a different perspective, sometimes it shifts our thinking about things. And if we're not talking about it, if we're not dialoguing, I'm not saying talking about it like it's bad, we've got to be in a negative feel about it, but it has to be. Communication is key to this conversation. It's key to unraveling things that are going on in our head that may not really be going on.
I think that was crucial, what you just said. We identify what we need to stop talking about, too.
Right.
But I think having the conversations will also enlighten us, and it makes us aware of when we're being unconsciously biased in some cases. And so that's reason to have it, and also so that you know that you are offending me, so that if you tell me that I'm articulate, you're offending me.
Right.
But if I don't have the conversation about it, then so of course there you out there saying, well, why is that offensive? Because why shouldn't I be articulate?
Right.
And every time someone says to me, when they're describing someone and they say they're so articulate, I already know in my head that they're talking about a person of color.
Right.
And generally they are, because normally I don't hear them say it.
Right.
Now, once in a while, I will hear them say it, but this is why we need to have this conversation about race. I know that in the work that Susan and I, the work that we do, we have open dialogue about race all the time. And, for the most part, Susan is well aware of things that happen, but sometimes I'll point out to her.
I was just thinking, that's why I was giggling in the background, was because I know that I have gained so much awareness, and you talk about the self-reflection and that place of noticing, as you said. I would say it's awareness, right? It's building that awareness of things that you weren't consciously aware of previously. And Terlyn has done a wonderful job of helping me to become more aware of things that go on even right in the moment with the two of us that I would not have ever necessarily noticed before. So for instance, there was one example was that we went to look at a venue that we were thinking about using for a retreat. And we walked in together, and we had talked to them ahead of time and let them know that we were coming and set up that we were going to have a tour and all of that. And the person who greeted us immediately came to me and introduced himself and whatever. And I didn't think anything of it. It just didn't occur to me. I just kind of figured, well, maybe I was walking a little ahead of her or whatever. But afterwards, she pointed that out. And she said, did you notice that he assumed that you were the one to talk to, while he or she is, she's my employer.
Right.
And I was just kind of along for the
Right.
ride and helping out and whatever. And so she
And there were several times
Right.
that
Yeah.
that happened,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But we know that we live in a
Right.
society that's racist,
Right.
you know, but that doesn't mean everyone
doesn't mean
is,
everyone
and
is.
nor does it mean that they are intentionally
Exactly.
being that way.
Right.
And that's the thing that we want to point out with the
Right.
self-reflection.
Right.
It's not an intentional thing. We show up the way we
Right.
show up. You know, as a mom, I show up to my kids
Yes.
unintentionally sometimes, some ways that I really don't want to,
Right.
but it's important for me to self-reflect. As a
Exactly.
wife, I do. As
Right.
a employer, I do. A friend. So it's really about we come with our own narratives,
Yes.
like you said, and I really, really appreciate what you're saying about how we show up.
Right.
You know, we are quickly running out of time
Yes.
here. I want to give you a final word, and then
Okay.
Susan is going to offer some golden
Okay.
rules
Mhm.
for
Sounds
us for
Yeah,
self-reflection.
and I just want to offer some tools that I use with when I'm coaching. I mentioned the notice part of it. So in the self-reflection, it's the notice. You notice what's going on and kind of have that place, and then the release. Sometimes you have to release some things that you're holding on to that you don't. And then in that release, sometimes there's an empty space, sometimes there's still something there. So then there's a rename and readjust place that I feel people need to go to. And when you rename and readjust, then you got to practice. And when you practice, sometimes you're going to what? Mess up. Sometimes you're going to do it well. Then you revisit. So that's a process that in the self-reflection, notice, you release, you rename or readjust. Then you say, okay, I got to practice this, and I'm going to revisit it.
So we might ask Marlecia if we can include those in the golden rules, and if she says
Absolutely.
okay, we will do that. But you really should check out Marlecia's website to learn a little bit more about what she does. Marlecia, can you tell them really quickly
Yes.
before Susan goes
It's
into the golden
Marlecia
rules?
Autrey at squarespace.com.
Great. So you can get in touch with her at Marlecia Autrey at squarespace.com.
Or at Epic Education. Epic
Okay.
Education.
EPIC Education?
EPOCH.
Oh, okay,
Epic,
EPOCH.
yes.
Okay, great. Really quickly, Susan, would you please give us
Okay.
some golden rules?
Absolutely.
And they will also be on our website as well.
Okay, so again, as those of you who have joined us in the past know, we like to offer a few golden rules from each of the different arenas of our lives: the sacred, the selfish, and the shared. So from a perspective of the sacred place, one of the things that we'd like to make sure to get across is that it's important that we believe that the way that I phrase it is that we believe that there's a hand to hold. And this is language that's come from another writer, Pema Chodron, but what she was trying to get at, and what I'd like to express, is just knowing that even when, for instance, as an educator, just as with therapists, you're alone in that classroom or that office. I mean, yes, people might come in and observe you once a year or something like that, but generally you're on your own. And so knowing that you're not really on your own ever, that there is something that you can reach out to that can help you through, and whether that's the sacred, maybe you don't have to feel like someone needs to come rescue you, as we were talking about before, but that you have a solid foundation of support there, from whatever the sacred is for you. Also, we offer that it's important to be grounded and centered and mindful, especially when approaching challenging conversations such as those about race or other differences around, whatever areas of difference there might be.
So I'm going to have to interrupt because we really are running out of time. So what I'm going
course.
to ask you all to do, you know that they are posted on our website, which is sacredintelligence.com. Please go to the website. You can download a list of the golden rules because we had so much fun. We ran out of time today. If you'd like more information about us, please, again, visit the website, sacredintelligence.com. I ask also that you go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel, Sacred Intelligence TV, and that you pass along this information to other folks so that they can join the movement as well and learn how to tap into that sacred intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I do hope that you will have a happy new year and a prosperous new year as well. Thank you to our guests, Marlecia
Thank you
Autrey
for
and
having
Susan
me.
Bainbridge, my co-hosts. Bye-bye.